You're going to hear from hundreds of individuals and groups asking for more money. My name is Franco Terrazzano. I'm with the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, and I'm here on behalf of 235,000 Canadian taxpayers asking you to spend less. I'm here today to say no more spending $8,800 on a sex toy show in Germany, no more racking up nearly six figures on fancy airplane food during a week-long trip, no more giving former governors general a $200,000 a year expense account for the rest of their life, no more taking pay raise after pay raise after pay raise while millions of Canadians struggle through a pandemic. No more giving 300,000 bureaucrats a raise while their neighbors lose their job or business. No more giving failing crown corporations like the Bank of Canada millions in bonuses. No more announcing $295 million for the Ford Motor Company, $420 million for Algoma Steel, $12 million for Loblaws, $20 million for Maple Leaf Foods, $110 million for Toyota, or announcing $372 million for Bombardier. Canadians need real relief. But Canadians are paying too much tax because the government wastes too much money. No wonder 72% of Canadians say they pay too much tax, according to a recent Ipsos poll released last week. 51 other national governments have cut taxes during the pandemic or to ease the pain of inflation. That includes more than half of G7 and G20 countries. 2/3 of OECD countries have also cut taxes during that time. While other countries cut taxes, Ottawa sticks Canadians with higher tax bills. The government has increased gas taxes, payroll taxes, and alcohol taxes. The government is getting ready to impose a second carbon tax next year through fuel regulations. But Canadians cannot afford higher taxes, and we can't afford to waste more money covering interest charges on the government's credit card. The government isn't scheduled to balance the budget until 2041 under the current trajectory. That's according to recent PBO data. Interest charges over that period will have cost taxpayers $800 billion by 2041. That's a cost of $18,000 for every Canadian, and is hundreds of billions of dollars that can't be used to improve services or lower taxes because that money is going to the bond fund managers on Bay Street. But there is some good news. The government could balance the budget next year. The government could also reverse its tax hikes, and the government could do that by bringing program spending back to the pre-pandemic and all-time high levels of 2018-19, adjusted upward for inflation and population growth. In 2018-19, the government spent more money than it did during any single year during World War II, even after accounting for inflation and population differences. That means the government overspent for years. So finding savings in every area of the budget should be like finding water in the ocean. Fortunately, we're now hearing the finance minister say that if politicians want to fund new programs and spend more money, they're going to have to find savings in other areas of the budget. And spending buckets of extra cash would only be pouring gasoline on the inflation fire. Now, we're sure that politicians of all parties would agree at least with some of the savings in the CTF's 80-page budget submission, and we're happy to work with you on that. Because Canadians are struggling, Canadians can't afford any more taxes, any more tax increases, and Canadians can't afford to waste more money on interest charges. Fortunately, the government can provide relief and balance the budget. It'll just take modest spending restraint. Thank you.
I'll start with the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. Of course, Canada is facing a labour shortage, and so as we should be always, I think it's incumbent on us as stewards of the economy to make sure, and just to do the right thing, that workers are fully incentivized for the hard work that they do. Canadians, of course, work extremely hard, some very long hours, and it's my belief that the government is taking too large a portion, and that doing things like tripling the carbon tax and increasing payroll taxes will do nothing but disincentivize work. Mr. Franco, would you care to comment?
72% of Canadians in a recent poll said that they pay too much tax. And if we want to encourage work, then we need to stop punishing work. And what we have seen is at the worst possible time, the government raise payroll taxes. So if you're making $65,000 this year, then the government is taking nearly $4,500 directly from you through your CPP and EI tax. And then you have to add on what your employer must also pay through the CPP and EI tax. So if we want to encourage encourage more work, we should stop increasing taxes on Canadian workers.
The increases in premiums for EI and CPP are needed to make sure that when people lose their jobs, in the case of EI, or when people retire, when our seniors retire, that the funds are there to ensure that they can collect their pension, or in the case of EI, that they can collect EI. So the effect of not increasing those premiums with the demand for those for EI and CPP would mean that when people retire or when people lose their jobs, they would not have the funds needed to collect EI. The funds wouldn't be there, certainly to keep up with demand, their needs, but also with inflation, and that would apply to CPP as well. Are you concerned about that?
What I'm so concerned about are so many Canadians who, in the private sector, just took it on the chin for 2+ years, while the people who are supposed to be their representative gave themselves pay raise after pay raise after pay raise. And not just that, raise the carbon tax, raise payroll taxes, raise alcohol taxes, and then play word games with Canadians using magic math when the government's own independent budget watchdog shows that the cost of these tax hikes, like the carbon tax, is costing the average household hundreds of dollars this year, even after the rebates. I'm concerned with the tax hikes. I'm concerned that all of this burden is falling on those hardworking Canadians who lost their job during the pandemic, while members of Parliament gave themselves pay raises, while 300,000 bureaucrats received pay raises, while failing crown corporations gave out bonuses and pay raises during the pandemic. So I'm very concerned about the tax.
Thank you very much. I've heard you. So I hear that you're not concerned about the pensioners and the EI recipients who wouldn't receive their funds. That's what I've heard you just say. It sounds to me like the Canadian Taxpayers Federation is actually not supporting the very taxpayers who would struggle the most in an inflationary environment, in the circumstance where they do retire and where they do lose their jobs. And I think that's really, really disappointing.
Well,
I'd like to move on to that. That wasn't a question.
I want to start off by apologizing to Mr. Terrazzano for Mr. Baker's very unprofessional behavior today. I know you, Mr. Terrazzano, and the CTF do great work and represent Canadians that have been hit by this cost of living crisis caused by a lot of what Mr. Baker and his government have been doing with out-of-control inflationary spending. I want to give you, Mr. Terrazzano, ample time to respond to Mr. Baker without being cut off.
Well, thank you. Well, thank you, member, with respect. And, I heard something about seniors, and you know who's really getting hammered by the inflation tax? The seniors who are living on fixed income. Now, what we've seen is out-of-control spending for years. Before the pandemic, the feds were spending all-time highs, even after accounting for inflation and population growth. Then, during the pandemic, the Bank of Canada printed $300 billion out of thin air. Then, the cherry on top for hardworking Canadians who are already struggling is the tax hikes. Carbon taxes up, payroll taxes up, and alcohol taxes up. And then just around the corner next year is going to be the second carbon tax coming through fuel regulations. And right in the government's own analysis of those regulations, it shows exactly who's going to be made worse off. Low and middle class Canadians, people who are already suffering from energy poverty, single mothers and seniors living on fixed incomes. And again, that's right from the government's own analysis.
Thank you, Mr. Terrazzano. I think you've raised some really important points, that it's the people on fixed incomes that are getting hit the worst. You pointed out, and it is important to note that the government did spend $100 billion even before COVID. During COVID, there was close to $500 billion spent, where almost a $250 billion, it wasn't even, had nothing to do with COVID at all. And like you said, there's going to be the tripling of the carbon tax that's going to be coming up. Now, there's also the point that over the last 7 years, many good energy projects were cancelled by the Liberal government, and now we see a 50 to 100% increase in home heating costs because of that. Do you think it's the right time to be increasing the carbon tax, or even have a carbon tax, when all we see is emissions going up?
I think it's the worst possible time. I think it should have been a no-brainer. At the very least, the government not raise taxes when so many people lost their job, when so many small businesses were worried that their savings wouldn't keep the lights on. Right now, we have people who are trying to drive from Port Hope to Richmond Hill for work who can't afford to fuel up their cars. And right around the corner is going to be winter time, and of course, the carbon tax drives up the cost to heat our homes during those cold winter months. But look, I don't think we should kid ourselves. The government knows that these tax increases are inflationary, and that's the whole goal of the carbon tax. Sometimes I think that the government pats itself on the back every time it sees the big prices at the pumps. Same with the second carbon tax. The government's analysis is very clear. The second carbon tax could add up to an extra 13 cents per litre to the price of gasoline by 2030. And of course, there are no rebates with the second carbon tax.
I agree with you. When a province like mine, Alberta, there's more Albertans that have to pay out of their pocket than what they get back from the rebate. And once the carbon tax triples, a Canadian family will pay up to $2,300 out of their pocket in carbon tax. And again, we don't see emissions coming down either. And we're seeing the money coming out of Albertans' pockets. Now, going to today's tax rate increases by the Bank of Canada, what do you think this is a reaction to?
Out-of-control spending for years. I mean, out-of-control spending drives up the cost of living. So I think that's exactly what the reaction is to. But let me just get back to Alberta, because we've heard the government time and again mislead Canadians by claiming that households get more money back with their rebate. But of course, the Parliamentary Budget Officer has shown that that is magic math. My family lives in Alberta too, and there's no wonder that Albertans just voted in the equalization referendum to stop being treated like the cash cow of Confederation. Well, this year alone, the carbon tax will cost the average household in Alberta $671, even after the rebates, according to the Parliamentary Budget Officer.
Now, time and time again, we do hear the Liberal government say this is not our problem. Inflation is by some act of God. It's a world problem. But recently, we've heard the former Bank of Canada governor, and a possible Liberal leadership candidate, Mark Carney, come out and say this is a domestic issue. And the current Bank of Canada governor has said this is a homegrown issue. Do you agree with that?
Oh, I certainly agree that the government created the perfect storm for inflation, which is too many dollars chasing too few goods. We've seen tax increases here in Canada while other countries are reducing taxes. 51 other national governments have cut taxes to ease the burden of inflation or during the pandemic, including many of our peers. More than half of G7 and G20 countries cut taxes. 2/3 of OECD cut taxes. And while our government has been increasing gas taxes, Australia cut its gas tax in half. The Netherlands provided significant gas tax relief. South Korea cut its gas tax by 30%. India cut gas taxes to, quote, keep inflation low, thus helping the poor and middle classes.
Back in 2019, a story came out that one of the Liberal MPs at the time had submitted to their campaign platform this idea of taxing home equity. And it became an issue in that election. And, of course, the Liberals denied that they had any intention of taxing home equity. But then we found out that CMHC had actually retained an organization called Generation Squeeze, had paid them over $200,000 to study this very thing. Now, the reason I'm asking you about it is that in your brief, you make note of removing the requirement to report the sale of your home to CRA. Now, I don't know of any other non-capital asset that a Canadian citizen might sell that they would have to report to CRA other than their home. So I'm wondering if you could comment on why do you think that requirement is there?
That's a great question. I mean, if the CRA isn't going to tax it, well, why do they want to know how much you sell your home for? Are they just curious? I've never known the CRA to just be curious. Now, what's so frustrating is that the Liberal Party in the last election, Mr. Trudeau, during the leaders' debate, said that they wouldn't bring in a home equity tax. So then why are taxpayers paying hundreds of thousands of dollars through a Crown corporation funding research into this home equity tax? And not just that, we dug up documents that show that staff in the Prime Minister's office met twice with the group that has been pushing the home equity tax. But not just that, we've also seen the Crown Corporation, the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, whose number one objective, according to its own website, is housing affordability for all. Well, in 2020 and 2021, Canadians couldn't afford to live in their homes or couldn't afford to buy homes. So why would that Crown Corporation then turn around and hand out nearly $60 million in pay raises and bonuses?
Thank you. Now, I wanted to talk to you about tax competitiveness has been on my mind. And I'm wondering if you have any information on where Canada stands. Like when major corporations look at where they're going to open their factories, do business, they look at countries in a way like a product. And one of the things they'll look at is how expensive is it going to be for our corporation, for our executives, for our employees? How much are they going to have to pay to live in a country like Canada? Where do we compare in the world to other countries on that front?
Unfortunately, among our peer nations, not good. So I have the results from the 2021 International Tax Competitive Index in front of me, and Canada ranked 20th out of 37 OECD countries on tax competitiveness, which is 2 spots worse than Canada's 2020 rank, and also puts us in the bottom half of the pack among our peers. Canada ranked 23rd on business tax competitiveness, Canada ranked 27th on individual tax competitiveness, and Canada ranked 24th on property tax competitiveness. Now, the report notes, quote, some strengths of the Canadian tax system, which includes the fact that Canada, quote, does not levy wealth, estate, or inheritance taxes.
Okay, and just on the issue of interest rates, one of the things that I think it's important for us to understand is that the government racked up more debt in the last 7 years and then all of the history of our country since Confederation. And they did it, essentially bragging about it, saying, well, it would be irresponsible not to borrow when interest rates are so low. But now the chickens are coming home to roost, aren't they? The interest rates are going up. Government's going to have to refinance each tranche of debt as it becomes due. What impact do you think that's going to have on our debt servicing costs? And do you think it might force the government to make some drastic decisions around further tax increases in order to continue to service our debt?
Well, interest charges next year, according to the PBO, are going to be about $42 billion, right? That's $42 billion that can't improve health care and can't stay in Canadians' pockets through lower taxes because that money's going to the bond fund managers on Bay Street. But, look, the Bank of Canada has one job, and it failed to do its one job. If you've been to a grocery store or a gas station in the last year, you know that. And even the Bank of Canada has admitted that they did not hit their inflation target. And even the Bank of Canada has admitted that they should be held accountable. Well, isn't it a funny way to hold your organization accountable than to turn around and hand out $45 million in bonuses and pay raises in 2020 and 2021?
Mr. Chair, for one last quick one, I want to ask you about the pay-as-you-go law, because I was fascinated last week to hear the Minister of Finance all of a sudden see the light and listen to what our leader has been saying now for months and months and months and months, that Canada should bring in a pay-as-you-go law. I'm wondering, from your perspective at the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, how can we trust the arsonist to put out the fire when they make a promise like this?
Well, look, it's not sustainable to spend more money on everything forever. That's not a good way to try to run the finances of a nation. But look, in our budget, we're showing that you could actually balance the books with modest spending restraint. Just bring back program spending back to the pre-pandemic and all-time high levels of 2018-19, even adjusted upward for inflation and population growth. So the government could balance the budget. It could find room to provide much-needed tax relief, and really it only takes modest spending restraint.
I just want to... Of course, climate change is a very real concern. But my challenge with some of these Liberal policies, one is they haven't hit once the emission targets. But my second concern is that as they increase the burden on taxpayers, on companies, on individuals, and on corporations, it gives them less ability to innovate, to be more sustainable, to embrace technologies that are coming out, such as carbon capture. Could you comment on that, whether you would agree with that?
Well, I think making it more expensive for people to fuel up on their way to work is a tax plan, not an environmental plan. And I think many Canadians right now are struggling, have been struggling through 2 years of the pandemic, are struggling now with high inflation. And I think we also need to look around the world and what other countries are doing. We saw Australia cut its gas tax in half, South Korea providing gas tax relief, Germany providing gas tax relief. I mentioned the United Kingdom providing gas tax relief. And immediately the government could hold a press conference and immediately help save drivers about $20 every time they fuel up their minivan at the pumps. I mean, they can save drivers between 18 and 30 cents per liter by scrapping or suspending federal gas taxes.
Of course, part of your mandate would be to examine tax policy and the equity and the fairness of it. So one thing that's always struck me about it is that, I never understood the rationale. In fact, when I had the Ministry of Finance, they just said because it's easier, which seems such a wrong answer, and that was the charging of GST on the carbon tax. That makes no sense from a tax policy perspective, from an equity perspective, or really any perspective other than, as the Ministry of Finance just said, it's easier. What's your thoughts on that?
The tax on tax is completely unfair, and as inflation increases, Canadians are paying more because of the tax on tax. When fuel goes up, the tax on tax costs Canadian more. When the carbon tax increase, the tax on tax costs Canadians more. And, I've spent a lot of my time talking about the carbon tax hike after carbon tax hike after carbon tax hike during the middle of the pandemic, but there's also going to be a second carbon tax coming through fuel regulations. And this one also has no rebate, and the government's own analysis has shown that it could cost another up to 13 cents per liter to the price of gasoline by 2030.